incentive as well. Today, I have the distinct honor of introducing our guest speaker. Her name is Lori Creed, and she comes to us from the University of Indiana. Lori received her bachelor's degree in history at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. She received her master's in history with a minor in comparative women's history at the University of Cincinnati. And currently, she's a PhD candidate at Indiana University, working on her dissertation on publishing the 20th century discussion of sexuality in the popular press. The title of her talk today is Alfred Kinsey and the Popular Sexology in the United States. So without further ado, if you could give a warm round of applause for Lori Creed.
Can everybody hear me? Good? Okay. Before I begin my talk today, I just want to thank Susan Williams and the entire GRCC Social Sciences Department's Planning Committee that put the conference together and that invited me to speak here today. I'm really excited to talk to you and share my research and just be a part of this dialogue that GRCC has put together on sexuality. Okay, I want you to think about in your mind the 1950s. Okay, what do you think about when you think about the 1950s? And what I want to do is start off with an excerpt from a popular magazine from the 1950s on sexuality. And the magazine was called Sexology. Okay? And this is what one of the readers wrote in to the editors of Sexology in hopes of receiving some help. Dear editor, in marital relations, I have never reached a climax during 10 years of marriage. I understand that this inability is due to self-gratification before and after marriage. It seems to me that the source of my sexual excitation is in the clitoris rather than my vagina. Can my condition be remedied? Okay, is that what everybody in the audience thinks about when they think about the 50s? Okay, think about that. When you think about stereotypes of the 50s, do you think about that kind of frank, open discussion about the human body and sexuality? Okay, this, what I just read you is just one example of the thousands of anonymous inquiries on sex that were published in the magazine Sexology. Was a popular sex science magazine on the margins of the mainstream press in the mid-20th century United States. What is especially fascinating about this reader who wrote in, called Mrs. C.M., is that the then current tensions or debates that surrounded sex, including moralism about certain practices like masturbation, ideas about the proper performance of the sexual act, notions that her own inability to climax is perhaps a medical condition, and her need to define her own pleasure are all embodied in just one letter from the 1950s. Further, the letter serves as an example of the simultaneously public yet private sides to sex, in that while the letter was actually published in a magazine in the 1950s and hence part of the public sphere, Mrs. C.M. from New Jersey remained anonymous and as such could gather information about sex on her own terms, relatively free from the intrusive, possibly moralizing gaze of family, friends, and neighbors. Mrs. C.M.'s letter and other letters from curious readers that appeared in the magazine offer historians, like myself, a rare opportunity to examine what concerns post-war Americans, meaning post-World War II, what post-war Americans had about sex, concerns that they wrote about in their own words that we can read today. And these letters were in their own words, and they interacted with the magazine's editors, and in this case, the resident sex expert, a sexologist and a psychiatrist called Dr. David O. Caldwell. Of course, with any source these letters are mediated sources, meaning that the magazine, after all, probably selected certain letters that they wanted to publish. Yet what I want to argue today is that the question and answer section in a magazine of the 50s, maybe not a mainstream magazine, but a magazine that was published nonetheless, that this magazine provides historians with a rich site where readers and the editors at Sexology, the magazine in question, where they can debate about and construct the idea of what sex actually is, what were the boundaries of sex, what were the meanings associated with sex, what was considered normal, what was considered abnormal. And what I want to do is put this in a little bit of context in terms of what historians and other scholars are concerned about today. Those writing in cultural studies, literary criticism, and reader response theory have suggested is that in situations where there's a writer of something, someone who produces a document, and a reader, they're not completely independent actors in the creation of social meaning. What they do is they come together and they form an interpretive community. Okay, the interpretive community in this case is sexology, where there were experts who were writing about sex and then readers who were reading it, consuming those ideas, taking some, maybe not, believing in some of the other things that they read about in the magazine. What I want to be clear about is sexology's interpretive community, that space that opened up between writers and readers, was a relatively liberal space where readers could write in and ask about highly personal concerns, read what other people had to say about their sexual problems or their questions about sexuality. And they all could listen to an expert who would not necessarily judge them or that they would have any kind of fear about bringing up. Maybe readers felt uncomfortable talking to their minister or their doctor about some of these topics. So it was a fairly liberal interpretive community. The other thing to keep in mind when you're looking at sources from this time period is that historians have suggested that by the 1950s, there was a sexual liberalism that flourished in the United States. When you first think about the 50s, you might think of sort of more conservative domestic images like Ozzie and Harriet and that kind of thing. So when you think of Ozzie and Harriet and sex, it just doesn't seem to really add up. But historians who have researched the period find that this was a period of relative sexual liberalism. Historians Estelle Friedman and John D'Amelio came up with a definition of what sexual liberalism is. And what they mean by sexual liberalism is a set of beliefs that detached sexual activity from the instrumental goal of procreation. So they said that under the ideas of sexual liberalism, you could have sex and not necessarily be thinking about having children. That under sexual liberalism, it affirmed heterosexual pleasure as a value in itself. So it was okay to have sex and just think about it in terms of your own personal pleasure. They defined sexual satisfaction as a critical component of personal happiness and successful marriage. And they provided youth with some room for sexual experimentation. Okay, and all of these things these historians have found in the 1950s. So far from the freedoms described in this definition of sexual liberalism, the 1950s, as we think about it today, really lives on in our memory as anything but sexually liberal. Like I mentioned, Ozzie and Harriet Nelson, magazines at the time, the sort of more mainstream magazines, were full of images of women in frilly white aprons, baking cookies, holding babies on their laps, that kind of thing. And some historians are suggesting that this wasn't the whole picture. For example, one of the scholars who has talked about the 50s in terms of sex says that sexuality in the post-war period was in some degree contained, meaning contained within the home, contained within the domestic sphere. Evidence of containing sex, meaning not putting it out in the public, and of resistance to any kind of sexual frankness. Evidence of that from the 50s includes the Catholic Legion of Decency, their efforts in the 1950s to limit the sexual content of movies through its own rating system. Also in the 1950s, the U.S. Senate put together committees to investigate filthy materials like comic books that they suggested corrupted youth. So in these cases, in the 1950s, sex was considered very private, and that anything erotic was restricted. Okay, but a lot of evidence that we have, and the evidence that I'm going to talk about today, suggests that sex was not really as contained as we might think it was, and that in fact it was pretty public. In many arenas, sexual liberalism, even sex radicalism, flourished in the post-war years. Since the early 1990s, some historians of women, gender, and sexuality have found that the 20th century trend of sexual liberalism proceeded in spite of efforts at restriction. Some evidence for sexual liberalism includes, for example, by the 50s, the increasingly erotic images that appeared in magazines such as Playboy, images on television, the formation in the 50s of the bad girl beat cultures, okay, and the women that's sort of associated with the beat culture. The creation in the 50s of lesbian and gay subcultures. And even on college campuses in the 50s, there were already debates about ending curfews for female co-eds that had to be in the dorms at a certain time. Okay, debates about that and should we really have those kind of curfews were already occurring during this time period. So in a lot of ways, sexual liberalism was growing and becoming more and more the norm. Sex was more and more on display and being debated about in the public sphere. Okay, so as Susan suggested in the introduction to the whole symposium today, one of the main ideas in my paper and in my research is that American sexuality and sexual habits are always socially constructed. Sex means different things to different people at different times, in other words. And some historians talk about it in terms of that sexual systems are not static structures, meaning sex can mean something different depending on if you're talking about it in the 1890s or the 1990s. And what I want to talk about in a little more detail is in the pages of this particular magazine that actually started in the 1930s and was published through the 1960s, that readers could write in, present their ideas, ask their questions, and then sex experts, such as Dr. Caldwell that I mentioned, could debate about that and figure out, well, what's appropriate sexual behavior? What does sex actually mean? What are the proper boundaries? Should we be discussing this at all? Okay, I want to talk a little bit about my sample of question and answers that I looked at for the magazine Sexology. Okay, I examined just one column in the magazine called the question and answer column. And the sample that I looked at was from 1946 to 1959. Okay, and so for consistency's sake, I looked at columns that Dr. David Caldwell was the person answering the questions. I looked at the columns where he was the resident sex expert as a psychiatrist. Okay, one thing you might ask is, what actually is sexology? Well, sexology is like any ology, like biology. It's a science. The ology means science. Sexology is the science of sex. And in the post-war period, it was becoming increasingly visible. It was during the post-war period that Dr. Caldwell, who worked for sexology, his contemporary, a zoologist who fashioned himself a sexologist, and his name was Dr. Alfred Kinsey. He became a household name during the 1950s. Kinsey's research on sex behavior was published in 1948 and 1953 as Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. Okay, and in these two books, he revealed that a wide array of sexual practices, including premarital sex, homosexual sex, and masturbation, were happening in the United States. Much publicized during the late 1940s and early 1950s, scholars have and historians have really explored Kinsey's research and what his impact was in the 50s, and his impact on American culture and how they defined sex, and what it meant, what were the proper boundaries. So I just want to give you a little more background on Alfred Kinsey. Okay, Kinsey was, by all accounts, an unlikely candidate to be a sexual liberal or to have such a huge impact on the sexual ideas and attitudes of Americans. He was born in 1894 into a devoutly Methodist family in New Jersey. His childhood was sexually repressed, according to a couple of his biographers. His childhood was sexually repressed by a stern father who was a teacher and a Methodist minister. Kinsey, growing up, had a strong interest in nature, scouting, and science. And he graduated from Bowdoin College with a degree in biology. After graduate school, he became a professor of zoology, initially at Indiana University in Bloomington. He built his academic reputation on a thorough study of the North American gall wasp, collecting thousands of samples of this insect very meticulously and labeling and pinning the insects. Okay, that you can see a little bit in the picture on the left. Okay, a young Kinsey at work on his gall wasps. Okay, he became interested in human sexuality when he was asked to teach a course on marriage and family for the undergraduates in the 1930s at IU, Indiana University. Kinsey's students he found them to be really hungry for accurate and specific information about their sex lives, about reproduction, and about sexuality in general. As a scientist, Kinsey quickly became upset because when he tried to do research to put together lectures for this marriage course on family, there really wasn't a lot of reliable scientific, and most important to Kinsey, non-moralistic, meaning not sort of making judgments about sexual behavior. He was appalled by the lack of that type of information that would be non-moralistic, would have scientific rigor about human sexuality. Some studies that would have been out when Kinsey was putting together his course in the 30s, there were a few out that had been done in the sex research and surveys about human behavior had happened in the 1920s, but Kinsey looked at them and thought, there's no scientific rigor here. There are certain flaws in the way the studies were done. So he wasn't really happy with what was out there. To try and fill in the gap in this scholarship, he began to collect his own data. Okay, much like he collected gall wasps, he started collecting data on sexual behavior. He took the sexual case histories of undergraduates who would volunteer to talk to him about their sexual activity. So he started out with students, and then he gradually sort of branched out from there. He got together his own research team. He came up with his own interviewing methods. He came up with standardized questions and ways to take notes where the researcher could quickly cover the whole sex life of whatever person they were interviewing. So from childhood through marriage, through adulthood. Okay, over the next 10 years, so in the 40s, Kinsey and his team recorded about 18,000 sexual case histories of American men and women, most of them being in the Midwest, where we are. And the results of his findings from all of these interviews were published in, like I said before, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, and that came out in 1948, and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, and that came out in 1953. So again, thinking about this time period, not a time period you usually associate with sex or knowledge being put out in the public sphere about it. Kinsey was as surprised as anyone that his studies attracted so much press. As you can see, he ended up on Time magazine's cover in 1953. He was really surprised at the attention because the book was actually an 800-page scientific treatise. The language was really dry. There was all this data and graphs and charts and number crunching. There wasn't anything very sexy or scintillating about his work. It was very academic and scholarly and footnotes and everything. Yet demand, obviously, for any kind of information on sex was definitely there in the public, and it quickly became, both volumes quickly became bestsellers. It was on the male volume, on the Human Male, which came out in 1948, was on the New York Times bestseller list for 27 weeks. And once the female volume came out a few years later, that too sold very well. And then after the female volume came out in 1953, he became sort of a national celebrity. And you can see him featured on the cover with the birds and the bees, sort of a quick sort of artistic reference to sex and his status as a zoologist, biologist. Okay, these volumes became, the female volume and the male volume became known as the Kinsey Reports. And what actually was in the reports was what caused such an uproar. In the volumes, he described the sexual habits and behaviors of thousands of folks that he interviewed, okay, or his research team interviewed. In the questions and in the interviews, he avoided as much as possible moralizing about the sexual behavior. Instead, he just approached the data like he did the gall wasps. He basically, in interviews and other publications from the time period, Kinsey is described as counting and cataloging what his respondents had done sexually, how many times they had done it, and at what ages. So it was strictly like, what did you do, how many times, when did it happen? Very scientific, very animal behavior, that kind of thing. According to Kinsey, the sheer number of cases he compiled allowed him to see and to argue that there was vast variation, okay, that sort of scientific word of when you study animals, there is a vast variation and degree of difference in human sexual behavior. Among his findings, which shocked a lot of Americans, especially anyone who was more socially conservative or had traditional values or ideas about sex, Kinsey reported without any kind of judgment saying this is bad or we need to fix this. He simply reported that about 50% of American women that he surveyed, for example, had had premarital intercourse. He also found that 37% of American men that he surveyed had participated in some sort of homosexual activity. He also reported in his male volume, so the volume that came out in 1948, that in the interviews it came out that there were nearly universal experiences of masturbation and heterosexual petting in his sample. So pretty much everyone he interviewed had some experience with those two phenomenon. Taken as a whole, the Kinsey Reports showed this sort of largely hidden world of sexual activity that nobody was really talking about much, at least not in the mainstream press, until the Kinsey Reports came out. And a lot of the behaviors that he found in the sample were really at odds with what Americans were saying publicly the social norms for sex were. So the things that he was finding out in the interviews didn't match with the way things were supposed to be, or the way folks ideally wanted American sex lives to be defined by. Okay, one of the things that was really controversial about Kinsey was he just presented this as, this is really unsensational. I did these interviews. He didn't make any kind of value judgments. He didn't label things as normal, abnormal. He didn't say anything was acceptable behavior or deviant behavior. He just said, this is the behavior. And by doing that, he kind of suggested that maybe we're misjudging. If large chunks of people are doing these behaviors, can they really be, why are we labeling them normal? Why aren't these more acceptable? Why don't we talk about them if so many people are participating in them? So what his reports revealed was there was this wide divergence between sexual ideals, what you were supposed to be doing, and actual behavior. And a lot of Americans were very shocked by that. And at the same time, some Americans found some sense of relief in that, wow, I'm not the only one that does X, Y, and Z. Gee, I thought I was kind of goofy or, abnormal. Kinsey's work, like any other scientific study, was criticized by many scholars. A lot of lay people criticized it as well. Some of the criticisms, just quickly, they argued that his sampling method was flawed, so the way he found people to be interviewed lacked scientific rigor. It wasn't random. Others thought that his sample, even though he did thousands of interviews, that it was too small to really extrapolate from or to say, this is true of America in general. Another criticism was that his questions that he put together didn't really prevent respondents, those who were being interviewed, from just lying and saying, oh yeah, I've had premarital sex, or oh yeah, I've done X, Y, and Z. So some lay people, some scientists said, this really isn't foolproof because you're dealing with people, and they might not necessarily be telling you their actual experience. Okay, another concern that folks had, critics had about Kinsey's studies was that as this scientist, as this biologist, what Kinsey was doing was just studying these acts, these behaviors, and he removed all emotion, human feeling from his study on sex. And that's always dangerous and kind of irresponsible when you're dealing with people and their lives and their relationships. Okay, you don't want to make it this sort of cold scientific fact, like pinning the little gall wasp. You need to consider more than just a sex act. You need to consider the mind and what is going on, and social norms are important, in other words. Okay, so they found it problematic that he was dealing with the human being as just this animal that was doing these acts. Okay, so whether you criticized or praised his work, Kinsey's pioneering research studies became, at the time, cultural landmarks. And soon popular writers, Time magazine, other, which is pretty mainstream, other magazines, especially like Sexology, that we'll get to in a minute, really started to refer to their works because there really wasn't a whole lot of information about what actually was taking place. That, it was incidental or what you heard from your friends in terms of what people were doing sexually. And this actually was a study. It had numbers. Someone bothered to actually do this. So people were kind of excited about just that fact. So people began referring more and more to his ideas, his findings, in their discussions about sex. And in part because of Kinsey and because, as I'll argue in a minute, because of magazines like Sexology, more and more people were talking about sex than ever before in public, not just in private. And that really helped to change things. It wasn't like all of a sudden in the 1960s people discovered sex and, freedom and hippies and all that kind of stuff. There are a lot of roots going on to the sexual revolution in the 60s, way back in the 50s with Kinsey, way back into the 30s with the founding of magazines like Sexology. Okay, so returning to the magazine Sexology, as I mentioned before, the editor of the question and answer section for this magazine was Dr. David Caldwell, and he was a contemporary of Kinsey, and he considers himself a sexologist, and he was writing on all of these ideas about sex and what people were doing even before Kinsey published his study in 1948. Sexology started in 1933. I just want to give you a little background about Dr. Caldwell. He wasn't as well known as Kinsey, but I would argue he was really well known to Sexology's regular readers. Originally from Cleveland, Ohio, he attended medical school at the Universidad Nacional de Mexico. He was a free thinker and an iconoclast, so much more sort of prone to radical ideas about sex than someone like Kinsey would have been. He practiced medicine privately for a while, and then he worked as a psychiatrist for the War Department during World War II. So bringing the troops in, if you were drafted to fight in the war, you were put through a battery of tests, and he was a psychiatrist that would check out your mental health. In 1945 and 46, he began writing full-time on sex-related topics for a few different publications. One was a socialist publication, and then the magazine Sexology. In addition to Dr. Caldwell, Sexology's staff and board of advisors varied throughout its history. It was a long history. It was published from the 30s through the 60s. So a lot of different doctors, sexologists, some psychoanalysts, social scientists, therapists, counselors, folks with a background in sex education, all worked for, a lot of them worked for Sexology. So by the time the Kinsey Report came out in 1948, there were already some people ready to read information like that and had already kind of been discussing sex topics for a couple of decades. The magazine was published monthly, and it featured frank and sexually explicit discussions about a wide array of topics relating to sex and sexuality. Think back to the letter that I quoted in the beginning of my talk. There was a wide array of topics. Almost nothing was taboo in this magazine. You could talk about, different articles and different questions talked about these topics: virginity, venereal disease, incest, penis size, breast size, transvestism, abortion, petting and what it was and what was okay and what wasn't, homosexuality, menopause, bestiality, impotence. Okay, those were just a few of the topics that, when I looked at the sample of magazines, that came up over and over. Okay, I want to stress that the explicit nature of this discussion of sex was taboo in mainstream magazines. It wasn't until the early 1970s that words like orgasm, masturbation, fellatio, those kind of specific and explicit sexual terms entered, for example, the women's magazines lexicon. You know, you go to the grocery store today and there's Cosmopolitan or something that you look at and they're mentioning this all the time, but it really wasn't until the 70s that happened. The other thing about Sexology, because it wasn't a mainstream type magazine, in fact, it wasn't sort of one of those big glossies that had, a huge staff like Time Magazine that put it together every month. It actually started out being printed on this, and this gets into kind of the history of publication and publishing. But when it first started being published, it was on like pulpy paper. So when you think about, pulp fiction and dime store novels, that kind of rough paper, it initially, that amount of expense, that type of publishing, Sexology fell into that category. It was kind of a sensational magazine. It was titillating. It had stories about primitive sex rights and curious births. So it was very sensational. In addition to kind of wanting to present medical information, it also kind of had to draw in this pulpy audience, okay, folks who would be reading these dime store novels. Originally, because the magazine was so explicit, it had to be sent to home subscribers in a plain brown envelope. So while sex wasn't necessarily tolerated in mainstream magazines, there was this way you could find out information if you needed it. Just one other thing to mention. The early motto, sort of the magazine had this motto, and the motto of Sexology was, knowledge of self, the doorway to health of body and mind. Okay, so they sort of talked about sex and understood it in terms of like, you need to know this knowledge to be a healthy adult. Interestingly, maybe to some of you, Sexology's founder, the one who sort of put together the idea for the magazine, the founder, the editor, the publisher, was a man named Hugo Gernsback. He was a wireless, meaning radio, manufacturer and inventor. And he founded magazines like Modern Electronics in 1908, Science and Invention, Radio News, and pulp science fiction magazines like Amazing Stories. So it's the same man sort of publishing these types of magazines. Some aficionados call him the father of magazine science fiction. And the reason that Gernsback didn't just focus on science fiction, he was quoted as saying the reason he bothered to publish magazines like Sexology was that even in the late 1920s, he, he could not understand why the public was kept in, quote, perpetual darkness and, quote, prehistoric ignorance about sex. So he was publishing science fiction, he was publishing other invention-type educational material, and he thought that this fit, with the other educational-type material that he was putting out. By 1933, Sexology had been launched as a magazine. It was not an instant success. At first, it hardly paid for operating expenses. A lot of people just thought, well, it's going to fail. Obscenity charges were filed several times against the magazine. Each time the charges ended up being dismissed. So it wasn't while it wasn't a mainstream magazine, it did manage to find its audience because it was still being published in the 60s. Determining who was the audience for Sexology is kind of problematic because it's not a mainstream magazine where readership numbers, subscription numbers are readily available to historians or other researchers. One historian has found that by the 60s, the magazine managed to be sold on newsstands, so actually out on shelves, and it was intended for men only who were 16 or older. Okay, so there would have been some restriction placed on who it was sold to. When I looked at my sample from the magazine, just by looking at the question and answers, it becomes obvious that really not just men were reading the magazine. I guess that's not surprising when women are interested in sex and sexual topics just as much as men. The readership of Sexology seemed like it was a lot broader than past historians have suggested. Of the 505 questions I looked at, 62% seemed like, from what I could tell from the question and what they said about themselves, and sometimes they would put like Mr. and then their initials, or Miss. 62% were men, and 37% were women. 32% were married, from what I could figure out, and 26% were single. Okay, the average age of the women writers was 31, and the average age for men was 32. So that average works out, but there were folks that were younger, folks that were a lot older writing in as well. And just to get a sense of who was writing into this magazine in terms of what class were they white, were they black, who were they? That's really hard for a historian to figure out from an anonymous question and answer column. The writers don't mention like, hey, I have a problem with my wife and I'm black, or hey, I need to know this about sterilization and I'm white. They don't really mention that. They just want to know the answer to their question about sex. Class is a little easier to figure out sometimes. In their question, they might mention what they do for a living. And just to give you an idea, some of the writers who wrote into the question and answer section were some of the occupations they mentioned: housewife, doctor, graduate student, high school student, minister, and one was a seaman in the U.S. Navy. So within those occupations, it seems like there's a range of incomes, a range of classes. Okay, so it was the sensational type magazine, a pulp type magazine that seemed like it was geared to people with kind of more lowbrow type tastes. But from the question and answers, it seems like a lot of different types of people at least picked it up to look at the question and answers. Okay, so my overall findings, just in looking at the sample of question and answers, is that within that column, there's a tension going on between this idea of that sex should be contained in the home, that you shouldn't talk about sex in the public, that it's this private thing, and then there were also elements of sexual liberalism that were present in the column. Okay, overall, the magazine Sexology represents a tilt toward sexual liberalism. Okay, so let's see. That clock is right, it's 2 o'clock? Okay. There are several topics that come up over and over again in sexology, like I mentioned. And I just Let's see, I guess I'll just go ahead and do one. One of the topics that came up over and over again in the questions, the sample that I looked at, were questions related to sterility and fertility. So why am I not having a baby? How do I prevent myself from having a baby? Those type of questions. Another topic that came up pretty often was homosexuality, just to let you know. So I'll talk a little bit about sterility and fertility, and then I want to have time to allow you guys time for question and answer. So I'm not sure I'll get to that today. Okay, the large number of questions surrounding the ability or lack of ability to have children is not really surprising, considering that the sample years that I looked at were from 1946 to 1959. And that, of course, encompasses the baby boom years in the United States. Historian Elaine Tyler May has argued that the post-war consensus, meaning sort of cultural ideals all being the same, the post-war consensus was nowhere more evident than in the matter of having children. When sexual ideals and behavior often diverged, reproductive ideals and behavior fused, meaning there was this baby boom. A lot of people were having children. So there was this, May and others have talked about this strong pronatalism that pervaded the era, almost to the point of compulsory parenthood, meaning if you didn't have children, you were kind of the odd person in the neighborhood. Okay, in fact, it was during this period that the Birth Control Federation changed its name to Planned Parenthood Federation of America in 1942. Just that name change marked a slight shift away from what might be a controversial organization with birth control in the title. They tried to make it a little bit more respectable by naming it Planned Parenthood. 2 years later, doctors formed the American Society for the Study of Sterility. Okay, people were so concerned about having kids, families, that they wanted to look into that sexual issue. So in my sample, about 48% of the men and women who wrote to Sexology about fertility issues stated that, hey, we want to have kids, but we can't. We want to have children, but we can't. About 20% that wrote in about fertility and sterility wanted to know about how they could prevent births through sterilization procedures like vasectomies. Men and women asked questions about fertility and sterility in about the same numbers. So were the readers and were Caldwell as pronatal as the rest of the country? Kind of yes and no. I mean, it wasn't as strong. It was more of a debated type of topic. And I'll give you an example. Mr. H.T. from Idaho wrote into the question and answers, I am 21 years old and my wife is 18. We are both interested in having a baby, but we are still childless. We are depressed because we are still childless. Okay, so they had been married for a year and a half. Mr. H.T. and his wife might have been reacting to the era's extreme pronatalism. They started to be depressed and worried when they weren't having children as their friends and family. Caldwell responded to the question that if Mr. H.T. was depressed, quote, because you resent not having a baby as others around you do, it may not be a good idea for you to try and have a baby. Okay? So he advised Mr. H.T. that some couples conceived for the first time only after years of trying, but that fertility tests could help define what their chances were. So Caldwell here is acting as a sexual liberal. He's saying he's separating sexual activity from necessarily, having a baby. He wasn't saying, definitely have a baby, you're right to be depressed. He was saying, let's step back from this. You don't need to be concerned if you're not having a baby. Babies weren't necessary for marital happiness. Okay, relatively few readers came right out and said, we're depressed because we're childless. Most of them just said, we have this desire to have a child. They explained what doctors had said their problems were, and they requested more information or what Caldwell's opinion might be. In a lot of cases, Caldwell, the sexual liberal, said, without actually seeing you, I can't help you, but there's more information at Planned Parenthood offices if you are interested. Okay, so there were definitely a group of readers who wrote in and asked about fertility and how do I become pregnant? Why haven't we become pregnant as a couple? Okay, other readers wrote in and expressed desires to, how can we prevent pregnancy? They were sexually liberal readers who said they were separating this idea of procreation or having kids from their sexual activity as partners. Like I said before, 20% of the fertility and sterility questions were about how to prevent pregnancy through sterilization. Here, often the writers stress that they couldn't really talk about it with their doctor, but if they had their choice, they didn't want to actually have any more children. Most often, Caldwell said this was a good decision, and he railed against some doctors' unwillingness to perform procedures like vasectomies. And I'll give you an example. Mr. W.I. wrote in 1948, and I'm quoting, "As my wife can have no more babies without great risk, we have decided that I be sterilized. This operation would be simpler and less costly than an operation to sterilize my wife." Caldwell replied that, "Apparently you are wise to have decided this." Another reader wrote in, Mr. CGR, he asked multiple questions about the effectiveness, the side effects, and the cost of male sterilization, and explained, quote, "My wife and I have all the children we can care for." Caldwell responded with a description of male sterilization, but noted, quote, "The greatest difficulty our readers report is finding a surgeon who is willing to perform the operation, though the operation is not illegal." Okay, here again, Caldwell sometimes referred his readers to Planned Parenthood for more information. So, let's see. The other thing important to note about readers' questions that had to do with fertility and sterility is a lot of them asked about, if we have the sterilization done, is it going to do anything to my sexual desire for my partner, for my wife, for my husband? And a lot of times the readers also expressed that they were too afraid to bring that up to a doctor or to family when they were discussing this. Sometimes it wasn't clear from the questions whether they had already had the procedures or not, but it was pretty clear that a lot of them were worried about, if we have this procedure done, is it going to affect sexual pleasure? So in those cases, it seems like, the readers were sexual liberals themselves and, didn't have worries about talking about sex as pleasurable, not just for having children. For instance, Mr. FSW worried, quote, "Will sterilization cause sexual weakness in the sex organs and glands?" And Mrs. CB wondered, quote, "Does a sterilized man experience as much gratification in sexual relations as before the operation?" In both cases, Caldwell was able to assure readers that sexual power and desire usually were not affected. Sterilization questions were treated differently for women. Some of Caldwell's answers to women writing in about these questions specifically set limits on what, even though he was a sexual liberal, he thought women's choices should be. So even in a sexually liberal interpretive community like this magazine, where you have this give and take on ideas, there were some double standards based on the gender of the reader. And I want to give you an example of that. Mrs. W.M. wrote, "I am 24 and my husband is 34. We have 5 children. Wishing to limit the size of our family, we are looking for a sure method. It seems to me that the sexual sterilization of my husband would be the least expensive and surest way. My husband objects because he says it would cause him to lose his manhood." Clearly, Mrs. W.M. had done some research, into what options were available. Even though Mrs. W.M. noted that there were some benefits to having the male partner in a relationship sterilized, just as other male readers had done, Caldwell's response was a little more argumentative with this female reader. And here's one of the things that Caldwell said. "If you have had all of the children you wish, you are the one to be sexually sterilized, not your husband. Suppose your husband is sterilized. Then suppose that, while he is still young, you should die. He then might want to marry again, and he and the second wife might want children of their own. What a dilemma for him if he had been sexually sterilized. But suppose you should be sexually sterilized and your husband should die while you're young, and you should marry again, and you and your next husband should want children of your own. Then you would probably write in and ask me, isn't there some way science can help me to have a baby for this wonderful man?" So when he answered Mrs. W.M., he was advising her to make her choices based on her husband's potential reproductive future and not her own. Even though he said that female sterilization is nearly impossible to reverse, while in some cases at least a male's virility could be restored. So there was kind of this letter was from 1953. There's a little bit of a sexual double standard going on there that's placing restrictions on women, even from a supposedly sexual liberal like Caldwell. Okay, the bottom line with at least this topic was that throughout the 1940s and 1950s, all of the questions and answers reflected at least a willingness to detach sex from the idea of just procreation. And that's really a key idea of that sexual liberalism, in fact, was flourishing in this time period, even though we think of the 50s as being more conservative generally. Okay, we have a little bit more time. It's about 2. Okay. Let me talk a little bit about some of the questions that were written in about homosexuality. Okay, one major exception to the trend towards sexual liberalism was sexology's treatment of homosexuals. While Caldwell treated homosexual queerists pretty sympathetically, and he gave them a public forum to actually ask questions about homosexuality that was rare in the 50s, he nevertheless labeled them as sexually immature or maladjusted. As historians John D'Amelio and Estelle Friedman have defined it, sexual liberalism during the post-war era was marked by pretty strict boundaries between heterosexuality and homosexuality. So while there were some more permissive attitudes about sex, that it was okay to think about pleasure and not procreation, there was more of a sympathetic attitude toward heterosexual expression of sexuality than to homosexual behavior. This isn't surprising for the period. the limits of sexual liberalism became clear in many of the questions, but especially in Caldwell's answers to them. But at the same time, what's interesting is even within this post-war period, there is a shift in Caldwell's attitude toward that became more sympathetic, which is kind of shocking. He eventually came to reject the idea that homosexuality was a disease, which is kind of early to be doing this in the history of sexuality in America. But he still really struggled in the question and answers to account for homosexuality and what its causes might be, and what do you tell readers who are struggling with their own sexuality. A lot of times what's interesting to see happen is Caldwell and the person writing in pathologized homosexuality, or made it seem bad. Even the readers who were writing in were saying, I'm immoral, what's wrong with me, that kind of thing. Over time, the magazine Sexology definitely became more sympathetic. And I just want to give you two examples to show you kind of the change that happened. The first example is from 1946. A 25-year-old called A.N. from Maryland wrote to Caldwell and described his own struggle with homosexual practices. Okay, and you have to think about it. He's writing in about his own homosexual practices. Well, if you're a reader, maybe you don't know that much about homosexuality, but as part of this interpretive community, you're becoming privy to this. And you're thinking, oh, well, so some people, what is homosexuality? What's going on with that? So it's kind of a learning and sharing type process. Okay, so A.N. wrote in from Maryland. After first revealing that his priest had advised him to write to Caldwell, A.N. relayed that he was, quote, a nervous wreck over having had sex with another man for 4 years. When they went to confession, quote, we had the wrongful nature of our acts pointed out and had to promise not to see each other again. It was much easier to promise than to do this. Okay, he goes on to explain that his pastor instructed him, quote, suffer if you must, but be pure. A.N. further explained that his male lover was dating a young woman, quote, to drown suspicions people may have of us. Okay, finally, he admitted that while he wanted a wife and child of his own, he hated to give up his lover, though I know it is the right thing to do so far as society and the church are concerned. Okay, and this is 1946. So a public debate about raising of the issue of homosexuality is pretty significant. Okay, obviously A.N. was struggling with his own feelings, social expectations, heterosexual sex and marriage. Should he go with what the social norms were? He was also struggling with religion. Okay, all of these things that Kinsey kind of was able to leave out of his scientific study. A.N. didn't want to give up his behavior, but he also wanted to be a good member of his church. It's also really interesting, just in looking at this particular question, that the priest is actually the person that advised the reader to write into Sexology. So, I mean, that indicates that Sexology reached a pretty wide audience. If a sexually conservative member of the community, such as a priest, would know about Sexology and know, where this person could go for advice. Another thing that's significant is the priest probably had some idea of Caldwell's position on homosexuality, because he wouldn't advise the reader to go to Caldwell if he was going to say, gosh, be open about it, just, live with your lover. The priest is thinking that Caldwell is going to agree with him. So the priest knew that Caldwell would probably be an ally in dealing with this particular person. Okay, the other thing to consider is that if the reader, A.N., hadn't actually heard about the magazine or read the magazine before the priest told him, he ended up having this other forum where he could talk about homosexuality besides the confessional. So sometimes historians talk about the move from religious authority of defining what is good behavior and what is bad behavior, or healthy or normal or abnormal, the shift from religious authority to medical authority. And just within the space of this one question, you see it happening. Okay, Caldwell's reply to this question was sympathetic, but it showed the limits of what sexual liberalism was. Caldwell thanked A.N.'s priest for his referral. Caldwell expressed gratitude that a respectable figure, such as a priest, knew about the magazine and, quote, the work that we are trying to do. Okay, so despite the fact that it's the sensational type magazine, Caldwell's saying we are trying to educate people. Indeed, Caldwell ended up diagnosing A.N. in a way that probably pleased the priest. He wrote that A.N. was a, quote, temporary sick man. The moralist says you are sinful, we say you are sick, just as though you had rheumatism. Caldwell insists that it's up to A.N. whether or not he chose to remain sick, but immediately instructed him, you have to stop seeing this other man. If separation hurts him, that is his misfortune, not yours. He advised A.N. to, quote, cultivate the company of good women and to marry if he met one he loved. Caldwell suggested that he needed a determination to cure himself, and you need to do it no matter how much it hurts you. So he was sympathetic, but he treated him like a sick patient, basically. So in 1946, even though Caldwell is pretty representative of a sexually liberal person, he's definitely being very strict about heterosexuality is the proper sexuality to have, homosexuality, no. But over the years, you can look at different issues of sexology and you can see that Caldwell is shifting in his ideas. For example, in 1950, Mr. B.R.W. from California wrote, I am a homosexual. In exploring his own sexuality, he explained, he had visited a psychiatrist who he said helped him to realize that his desire for homosexual experiences, quote, arose from earlier conditioning when I was too young to know the consequences of such experiences. What he concluded in the letter about his own sexuality was that, quote, plenty of hard work is needed to break established habit patterns. And here, scholars, when they're looking at a letter like that, you can see the reader adopting the language of his psychiatrist in his own understanding of his sexuality. Mr. B.W.R. accepted psychiatry's diagnosis of homosexuality as a form of maladjustment, of arrested psychosexual development, if you want to use an especially big phrase, basically mental illness. The reader said that he planned to follow his psychiatrist's advice and try and break this habit of homosexuality and wondered what Caldwell had to say. And surprisingly, in 1950, Caldwell avoided any kind of harsh diagnosis and cautioned the reader against suppressing any sexual tendencies that he might have. He came right out and said that, quote, homosexuality is not a disease, and this became kind of a mantra that appeared in the magazine over the next few years, from the late 40s on, from about 49 to into the 60s. Since homosexuality was not a disease, it did not need to be cured, any more than the heterosexual needed to be cured. Caldwell then realized that he was shifting his opinion on homosexuality, so he talked a little bit at length about this. And I'm quoting Caldwell. Quote, the great psychologist, Dr. Sigmund Freud, said that he had constantly revised his views, his findings, and his teachings as he himself advanced in knowledge and experience. Okay, here Caldwell is seems like he's attempting to account for his change in saying that, even an important thinker like Freud recognizes errors in his past theories, new information that might cause a change. Caldwell admitted that in his opinion, quote, there probably is nothing involving the sexual nature that is less understood today, meaning 1950, than homosexuality. So imagine being a reader and reading that. If you're gay or if you're straight, then that's kind of a significant admission to hear about when homosexuality is generally a taboo topic. Caldwell suggested that while humans go through a series of sexual development stages, heterosexuality was still the ideal, but it was the ideal only because each of us has male tendencies and female tendencies within ourselves. So here it seems like he's picking up on, he's writing this in 1950, he's picking up on some of Alfred Kinsey's ideas about sexuality, and that there is a great variety to sexual behavior, and sex itself was relative. Kinsey, for example, has suggested that there's so much variety in sexual practices that humans who are homosexual, humans who are heterosexual, there was actually this scale, and that most people weren't completely one or the other. So sexuality was relative. It wasn't like a one or the other type thing, that they actually could coexist even within one person. Okay, so again, Caldwell is putting out some then current theories about this and letting readers know about this and think about it and decide for themselves. Okay, so while Caldwell admitted that homosexuality was poorly understood, he didn't right away in 1950 say it was abnormal the way he did in 1946. And some historians, looking at this type of information, might say that Caldwell actually empowered Mr. BMR by suggesting that he should actually choose and shape his own sexuality, to look at his own desires, and go with what he felt. Okay, and just one last thing. So Caldwell was, in this question and answer exchange that we just talked about, was being very accommodating and saying, homosexuality was this option. He wasn't automatically saying it's abnormal. But then there was an accompanying illustration with the question and answers. And the illustration shows 3 different trees that show the sexual development of children, the smaller tree, and then heterosexuals being the middle tree, and homosexuals on the right. Okay, and according to this chart, in children there's tendencies for both. Okay, and then that's fine, but the graphs indicate the middle tree shows in adulthood the heterosexual urge overcoming the desire for a partner of the same sex. Okay, and if you can see, it's kind of blurry, I guess. In the middle tree that's heterosexual, that's characterized by mental stability, a strong business urge, and I think it says healthy attitudes. Let's see. So the heterosexual tree is characterized by mental stability, healthy attitudes, and a strong business urge. Okay, then the tree sort of that's heavily black is an adult where the homosexual tendency won out. And that chart is saying that if the homosexual urge wins out, these are your characteristics. Abnormal fears, neurotic tendencies, a weak business urge, those were characteristic of a homosexual. So while Caldwell was being kind of sexually liberal and accommodating and saying there was room for homosexuality, the graph comes out and says, it's a problem. If you choose homosexuality, these are the kind of things that are going to characterize your life. So even within a question and answer, there can be all of these sort of competing ideas. Okay, I have a little bit more, but I just want to conclude because it's already 2:30. I'd like to suggest that while cultural assumptions about men, about women, about sexual norms, about the sexual double standard, all of those type of things, all of the cultural assumptions that we have were present in the question and answers in sexology. But the important thing to note was that at least the magazine opened up a conversation about sex that allowed some debate over sexual issues and practices. Okay, and this conversation existed even before Kinsey kind of spilled it out on the general public in 1948 and 1953. Okay, and just by looking at these question and answers, you can see people struggling with what are sexual mores, how should they change, what was normal, what was abnormal. And sexology was an important public place where sex could be debated, and it wasn't necessarily labeled as wrong, right, normal, abnormal. Again, coming back to this idea of that it's an interpretive community. The editors put together this section, they selected some letters, readers had some input in terms of what was covered in the magazine by what they wrote in, and they could choose to take the advice or not take the advice. Okay, month after month, readers could trace the evolution of his thinking, Caldwell's thinking, and the types of questions that appeared, just as I attempted to do. So they could see ideas changing and being debated. So experts were involved, readers were involved, and just looking at this question and answer sample shows the tensions that existed in American culture about what sex really meant, and how sex should be understood by Americans, both before Alfred Kinsey's research and then continuing on into the 1960s. Thank you. I know that was kind of a lot to throw at you. Does anybody have any questions? I'll do my best to answer. One thing I will note, if you have specific questions about this time period and sexuality, or just sexuality in general, go to Indiana University Bloomington's website and look up Kinsey Institute. I talked a little bit today about Alfred Kinsey. He founded, in order to publish his studies, he founded a center on sex research, and it's still operating today, okay, on the campus where I'm a student. So if you have questions, if you're interested in the topic, it's worth looking up. The website is pretty user-friendly. Okay, does anybody have questions?
I have a question. I know that at this time that you're talking about today, and then in an earlier generation, and even into the succeeding generation, in many places of the United States, it was illegal to discuss issues such as birth control. I know Margaret Sanger ran into that repeatedly in her career, and I'm wondering if those states that had those laws in the book, for example, Massachusetts, some of the most strict ones, did that influence the scholarly community who wanted to publish and lead this discussion?
I think it depends on, that's a really good question. I think it depends on the decade that you're talking about, and like you said, the state. Sexology was published out of New York State, and like I said, the magazine itself was brought up on obscenity charges several times, just in putting the magazine through the mail. the Comstock laws, things like that, that prevented mailing obscene material through the U.S. mail. But the charges, so far I haven't been able to find specific material on the individual cases about how they worked that out. But yeah, I mean, it definitely had an impact that there were laws on the books, like the Comstock law, that prevented kind of public discussion about sex, and especially in any kind of explicit way. So I mean, that's why sexology is kind of important, because it shows that it did exist even, before the 60s.
How did the U.S. compare to like the rest of the world when you think of sexual liberalism in that time period? Were we like ahead or behind Europe and other cultures?
That's a really, really good question. I know that in the 40s and the 50s, England had their version. He was called the English Kinsey, who was doing similar type research. And I'm not, beyond England, I don't know. In part would be, that would involve, the rigor of the scientific community, in any said decade or whatever, in whatever country, the education systems, their commitment to academic freedom, that kind of thing. One of the things, if you're interested in Kinsey, one of the things that was important that got his research going was that IU had a president at the time who was willing to go along with him and see where the research went, and thought it was important enough to pursue. So the academic freedom in the United States certainly didn't hurt. Does that help?
Thanks.
Can I ask one? It's good to have the microphone, Lori. You mentioned that in the question and answer portion of sexology that there's a shift in the late 40s in terms of the way that they dealt with the issue of homosexuality. I wonder if you could tell from your research, or if you know, why that shift is taking place at that particular time.
Well, I think the Kinsey, even though sexology had sort of started talking frankly about such topics as homosexuality as early as 1933, the publication of the Kinsey Reports in 48 and 53, that's, for example, showed statistically that in Kinsey's sample, men were participating in homosexual acts. I think that definitely impacted the ideas and the theories about sexuality that Caldwell was presenting to his readers. So I think in that sense, Kinsey was really important. His ideas started filtering down to other places, other professionals who would have dealt with topics on sex. Okay, part of the reason Kinsey did the research was, he was one of the people sort of, with the burden of teaching this marriage class in the 30s. So, just getting that out there. And then the medical community teachers were, benefited, or at least could look at his research.
Did you notice the readers that were writing in changing the way they talked about homosexuality as well, based on the way the changes in the magazine were taking place?
That's a really, really good question. And I think my initial response to that would be not really. A lot of them wrote in and, it said, I talked to my family and they're not accepting me, or, I went to my priest or my minister and they're saying this, is this true? Is there help? What can I do? Should I just accept it? Should I not? So it's still pretty much a struggle for the readers, from at least the sample that I looked at.
Thanks.
Yeah, Rick Verberg, one of the trustees here at the college. Sexology is an area that I spend a lot of time reading into, but I just wonder, when you think of medicine in that area and all the advances that, just with a cursory view of it, it seems like that, as far as this area, that has the research kept up in this area, or has it kind of hit a plateau, or any comment on that?
Just in general, sex research and sex therapy is still sort of a flourishing field. I mean, at least if you ask the folks at the Kinsey Institute, and I'm in a building near their center, their library, and that kind of thing. And I mean, their goal is to help people, and as long as people have issues, questions about their own sexuality, they need therapy, they need help, they have particular problems, that it's still a field that attracts folks into, just as, to be a doctor or to be, a psychologist or that kind of thing. They sort of look at it as a helping field. So it is actually research, and that is still going on. Does that help?
Yeah.
It seems kind of interesting that the magazine would go from the 30s to the 60s, when you think in the 60s it would then blow up into a bigger need for the community. So do you think that the ending of this magazine is a shift from a more socially responsible perspective of the topic to a more disastrous kind of area, or?
I'm not sure what I know what you mean by disastrous area. What?
Well, it just seems that this magazine is a really responsible approach to a topic that is kind of taboo, whereas then in the 60s and the 70s, that topic kind of goes down a bad road. Do you think the ending of this magazine has something to do with that?
I don't know. That's a good question. I see. I think I see what you mean. I mean, it's kind of a mixed bag. If you look at sexology itself, I mean, in the question and answers, the expert that's answering them, a lot of the material that's in the question and answers depends on who the expert is. How reliable the advice is, or how liberal or how conservative, that kind of thing. That changed. Caldwell only worked there for, several years, and then it was other folks. The editorial board shifted. So while I mentioned that Sexology initially was kind of more of a pulpy magazine, cheaply printed, a lot of the stuff that was featured in the magazine other than question and answers was very sensational to draw readers in, that kind of thing. So it wasn't necessarily 100% reliable. Okay, it was always kind of a mixed bag. The 60s and beyond, there's probably a lot of reasons why the conversation about sex went the way it did. And as you say, maybe kind of went downhill. A lot of it depends on what sources you're looking at. As a historian, if you're looking at, say, movies, or you're looking at, medical advice literature, which some historians might want to categorize sexology as, depends on what type of sources. Certainly, there's a big difference in mainstream magazines from the 30s when this was founded to the late 60s about like what could be on the cover of a magazine. In the 30s, Playboy wasn't out yet, that kind of thing. So the debate and the discussion about sex is just influenced by a lot of different things. So I don't know if you can just say sexology. Does that make sense, or?
Well, thank you very much, Lori Creed, Indiana University.
Thank you, everybody.
Ladies and gentlemen, two things. First of all, we do value your feedback, so either please,